Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today, Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you in studio today.
Yes, I returned. Good to see you, Dr. Paul.
Good. You know, there's a lot of stuff in the news, and usually we're wanting to look at the news and what's the big issues. But the big issue today is, in the news, from my perspective, is something I don't want to talk about, and that has to do with recounts.
Oh, yeah.
I just can't get too enthusiastic about worrying about that and what is the strategy. But, you know, the mainstream media, they're really tense on that. But while people slept and were engaged with the recount, we've been looking elsewhere, and lo and behold, a city that we've talked about and the country has talked about for a long time, especially in the last 5 years, a city in Syria, and that is Aleppo. Things have changed there, especially most recently, just this past week, significant changes. And I'll read this one headline. It comes off Zero Hedge. It says, Assad on verge of the biggest victory since start of Syrian war with imminent capture of Aleppo. And the way I understand it, the country is divided, but since the Russians have gotten in there and helped their ally, things have changed from a few years ago. But the real civil war, I think, was aggravated and started, and there were problems there. Is when Obama decided Assad had to go. Of course, that position has changed a bit. But there are 5 major cities in Syria. Aleppo and Assad controls 4, and this is the 5th one. It looks like he's probably going to take this over again. So I'm sure you've been keeping up with this, and the factions, we'll have to continue to sort out the factions, but I think most of the time people see it with the factions, the major factions, I would assume would be Assad with the Russians and some of their allies versus United States aligned with some others who would like to see Assad go.
Yeah. You know, it's always been confusing for everyone, I think, trying to follow the different alliances and the inconsistencies. You know, we're fighting Iran-backed groups in Syria, but we're backing them, or at least we're happy that they're fighting with us in Iraq, even though they're fighting the same people in both places. And I think it's actually just gotten a little more confusing in some ways. But you're right, there is the probably inevitable fall or liberation, depending on your perspective, of Aleppo. And we do have a map actually showing the dramatic shift in eastern Aleppo. And if you look in the left, this was earlier this year, the green is the opposition rebel forces and how much they controlled of eastern Aleppo. And on the right, you'll see what they've lost over the past week, actually. And the yellow is a Kurdish area. The Kurds are also helping get rid of the Nusra Front groups that were controlling it. So there is very little left of rebel-controlled East Aleppo. According to media reports, a lot of the fighters that are from that city are surrendering. RT reported some 500, who knows, and thousands of people now, because of the gains over the past week, these people who have been held down by the rebels, a lot of them have fled. These people are coming out now in the thousands, so dramatic shift.
Well, there was an interesting statement in the news regarding this that I found a bit fascinating, but it reveals the complexity of this. And this has to do with Kerry. I think it was reported by Josh Rogan about what our position should be in this area, and what actually did you find that Kerry is recommending. This is the bizarre thing that, at one sense, of course, the good position would be just not even being involved there, but on again, off again stuff. So what was he having a conversation with the Russians on a different policy than we've had in the last couple of years?
Well, this is Josh Rogan wrote in the Washington Post on the 27th, which I guess is 2 days ago, that his sources tell him that John Kerry, Secretary of State, is working feverishly to strike a deal with Russia to stop the government advance in eastern Aleppo. So they want to stop this advance that they're getting rid of these rebels. Apparently, they're worried that the next president will strike a different deal with Russia and abandon the regime change. So he's rushing to try to get a deal with Lavrov to preserve rebel-held eastern Aleppo, but I think he's finding that, at least according to Rogan, and it makes sense, that he does not have authority from the White House to threaten Russia or to pressure Russia. So he's essentially being seen as a guy with not a lot of power, trying to negotiate something that he doesn't have a lot of authority to negotiate.
Well, it seems like we're in an impossible position, which is not unusual in our foreign policy. So we want originally, at least for the past several years, to get rid of Assad, and Assad's our enemy. But ISIS is supposed to be our enemy. But if ISIS is in there fighting to do what we don't want, then we have to say, well, we'll work with ISIS, in one day conditions, and of course different position in Iraq. So I don't see how anything really positive can come out of this. I think that obviously. I think the Russians are going to come out pretty well on this. I think Assad is going to survive. I think maybe the Kurds are going to carve out a piece of territory for themselves, and they'll work something. It could be that the United States is going to have egg on its face. But this may backfire from our position, because if that looks like the case, this is just going to incentivize these radical neocons to say, see, he's failed again. He's a weak president. Drop some bombs on him. The only thing going for us on this is that, and we're not certain about what's going to happen, is that doesn't seem like it would be high on the agenda of the president-elect because of his sympathies for Russia. So it'll be interesting to see, because ordinarily, if we're being challenged by Trump's comments, he's usually wants to be pretty aggressive, but it doesn't look like that is going to happen, because he has already challenged his vice president nominee on his hawkishness. So it's sort of a scramble for trying to figure out what's going to happen here.
But the only caveat I would say with that has been his bellicosity toward Iran. I mean, Trump, and I think he's got a lot of people around him that are telling him, you got to go after Iran. So it looks like a Russia, Syria, Iran victory in Syria. Who knows what Trump would do if he has designated the real enemy is Iran. And if he wants to do something to attack Iran in Syria, that would be a real shift away from what you're suggesting.
Yeah, and this brings up the subject of who really won the Iraq War. I don't think the neocons claim they didn't win because Obama wouldn't fight to victory, although they were following a Bush policy, and it was totally exhausted. But I think as it stands now, the Iranians and the Shia are victors there, and this I can just see what's going on in the minds of the neocons now, and then it is further complicated because the potential people in the new administration are not exactly strangers to the neoconservative viewpoint. At the same time, Trump says things that maybe would challenge them. So it's so messy. I think interventionism is so messy because you can't predict what an interventionist will do. Day to day, they'll change their position. They'll have different allies and this sort of thing. Where if you go from a non-interventionist and doing things for the interests of our own country, there shouldn't be any of this questioning, because the American people don't know how much of this is going on and how much is costing. They got to know a little bit about the tremendous mess that Iraq was, and how many trillions of dollars were used, and thousands of Americans killed, and hundreds of thousands of Arabs killed. They never quite get around to saying, well, what are the consequences? Do you think this could be related to terrorist attack and blowback? Yeah. Oh, no, impossible. That couldn't be it. So they sort of, just let that pass by. And right now, I would say more so than any. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot in the news today about Aleppo. It's still going to be on counting votes in this last election that people are trying to wonder who won that election, really. Yeah. And we're trying to figure out who's winning the war over in Syria, and how it's going to help us. Is it going to help our position or hurt us? How is it going to help us financially? Is it going to make us more safe, or is it going to endanger us? And those are the kind of questions I think go unchallenged.
And here's why the interventionists will always lose with their projects, because they don't understand the complexities of human life, the complexities of other cultures. For all of his flaws, Saddam Hussein was able to strike a balance between Shia, Sunni, and Kurd in Iraq. Okay, he may have used a lot of force to do it and brutality to do it, but he was able to strike some kind of a balance where the country worked. The neocons came in and tore it all apart and turned it into a situation where the Shia, the Iranian Shia and the Shia in Iraq, literally, and I think correctly, view this as a fight for their survival. They're fighting for their survival. They have a hostile Saudi Arabia. They have the hostile Sunni world. They have a hostile Israel, all armed against them. So they were motivated by U.S. interventionism in Iraq. Now that the balance was destroyed by the intervention, we've got to fight for our lives. We have got to stake out some territory here, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, a realistic approach and understanding. I talk about, and we've talked a lot about 2011, and that was the major announcement that we would get involved. The Civil War really wasn't, it was brewing, it was simmering, but it hadn't broken out. But it really broke out once we got involved with the announcement that our position is to get rid of Assad. But our obsession with intervention, as it has been for 50, 60, 70 years, we've always been involved in picking out our friends and getting involved in elections, and our CIA being involved in overthrows. It's just been going on, it seems like forever. But they actually did some talking about Assad and changing it back in 2005 about what they think our position ought to be, and that probably went pretty well unnoticed.
Yeah, that's important, because the mainstream press in the U.S. will like to portray it as, in 2011, motivated by the Arab Spring, the Syrians rose up for democracy. That's the narrative. But the real narrative, thanks to our friends at WikiLeaks, who have given us so much information, we talked about them yesterday, Assange and WikiLeaks, they're shining the light on what happened. They released a 2005 cable from the U.S. Embassy in Damascus to the main state in Washington. And it essentially was their top political officer in Syria outlined a roadmap for regime change in Syria back in 2005. And that roadmap is essentially what has been followed since the 2011 outbreak of unrest.
Does that remind you? It reminds me a little bit about some of the things that we finally read about the planning of the coup in the coup against the Russia, the elected leader of Ukraine.
Oh, sorry, yes, Ukraine, yeah.
The Russian elected leader in Ukraine, and here we had communication between our ambassador and others saying, well, we got to get rid of that. And then remember Hillary's statement, well, we better sit down and decide who we want to have win this election. And she wasn't talking about her own. She thought she had already won that when she was talking about some other countries.
Yeah.
And that is so tragic that is what the way our diplomats think.
And these leaks are so beneficial because they show Americans how these people operate. They're viewed as being, cold, professionals, well-trained. And in reality, they're down there on the ground saying, remember Victoria Nuland, Yachts is the guy. This guy, no, we got to push him there, And this shows what, if Americans knew what was happening, and if it worked, it would be bad enough because it's immoral to fiddle in other people's business. But it's been spectacularly failing.
But you know what most Americans don't realize is the geography of all this. I mean, Ukraine happens to be pretty close to Russia. And, Syria happens to be pretty close to Russia, as well as the Russians have a base there. And, of course, we've shown the map where our bases sort of surround the Russians. And they're on their borders, and we're building and putting more missile sites right on the borders, very close to the Russian border. And they don't usually say, well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What would it be like if they were doing it over here? One time the Soviets did it in Cuba, and it annoyed Americans quite reasonably so, and we had to confront them. But the stuff that goes on there is not seen in reality of what it does, and what the problem really is not getting the information out here.
So our I wouldn't say enemies, but our adversaries would say, just you saying that proves that you are a Russian propagandist, because you dared question putting the missiles all around Russia. You know, they never would stop to consider the fact that we just don't want World War III, and there's no point to it.
Yeah, I found that charge toward us and me in particular, that I was pro-Soviet and therefore I was pro-Trump. Well, I don't remember being on Trump's campaign banner at all.
You were criticized during the campaign for being too critical of it, by even a lot of libertarians.
Well, I guess if both sides are criticizing us, maybe we're doing something right.
But if I could just say one quick, the implications of the loss or the fall of Aleppo, and this is the point that Zero Hedge made in a very important piece today, I think. If Aleppo falls, that will lead toward the regaining of control of the country from Assad, essentially. But the fall of this final population center also means that the next administration will have less leeway to accelerate, to ratchet back up a regime change operation that has sputtered and appears to have died. So that is good news for non-interventionists, that in a practical sense, intervention has failed. But as we talked before the show, philosophically, it's not yet in the victory side.
And I think that might have been a motivation by Assad and the Russians to clear this up and get it settled before. Not so much that they knew exactly what would happen, but probably because of the unknown of the new administration and because there are neocons. Looks like they'll be in the new administration.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. This is a very important subject. We want to call attention once again to Syria and today, especially in Aleppo. Events will evolve here rather quickly. Certainly, we're proposing the idea that it'll happen certainly before the new president is sworn in. But thank you very much for tuning in, and please come back to the Liberty Report soon.